The two high-level concepts I'd like to share with you today are folk theory, so that's two words, folk theory, and it has some connections to things like mindset, mental models, and implicit theory, so those may be familiar to some of you. And the other one is a theory, very powerful, weirdly, widely applicable theory from psychology called the stereotype content model, or the SCM. I'll start with folk theory. Folk theory is our understanding of complex systems. And so the example that I often use is my daughter, who's 8, recently asked me how gravity works. And I was like very excited to tell her because I'm a professor and everything. And I'm like, well, you know, really big objects attract smaller objects to them. And she's like, oh, great. Why? And then I was like, huh. And it turns out that I don't know how gravity works. My folk theory of gravity is totally sufficient for my day-to-day life and keeping me and my daughter alive, but I don't have a scientific theory of gravity. So I don't know where the gravitational coefficient comes from and how gravity bends space, for example. So it turns out we have these kind of folk theories for all kinds of things, from how helicopters work to the way that, say, a toilet flushes. And so we started thinking about what kind of folk theories do people have about technologies. In particular, we've looked at things like the Facebook newsfeed. Some of you may remember the Facebook emotional contagion study that manipulated people's emotions in the newsfeed by changing their newsfeed. And it led to worldwide controversy about some of the ethics about that. And that was my study. And one of the things we were really curious about was why did this study upset people so much? And what we came to understand was we had violated their folk theory. They thought of the newsfeed as like a platform or a window into their social life. And windows and platforms don't experiment on people. And they had very little sense of the fact that there was an algorithm moving content around for them. They thought that they were just seeing what their social network was up to. And so the idea of folk theory, I think, is important and bigger than mental model, because mental models are like, okay, how does that thermostat work and what are the input outputs of things? Whereas folk theories allow for attitudes and affect. So for example, we've done this huge series of studies on the Facebook newsfeed, and there's 4 main folk theories that people have. One is spy, which has a very negative valence, and that it's this entity that's taking things from them and spying on them. Example metaphors are like paparazzi. There's another different one, which is the butler. And this is one where this system actually goes and gets things and brings them to the person. So why does folk theory matter? Well, if you have a spy folk theory of, say, your Facebook newsfeed, you're less likely to contribute information into the newsfeed and more likely to just watch. Whereas if you have a butler type folk theory, we've shown that people engage with the system much more. If we're coming to a building, we tend to also have affective approaches to buildings and attitudes, where the buildings can be helpful or they can obstruct us. And so it's not simply how buildings work as they become more intelligent and interact with us, but also what our attitudes towards those buildings are. So I think folk theories could be a really interesting high-level thing to study in the context of how do buildings convey their what should be the folk theory that people have of them. And if it's designed wrong, it could lead to folk theories that have a mismatch with what people expect. The second idea is this stereotype content model. This is from Susan Fiske, one of the greatest living social psychologists in my view. And this model tries to capture the main dimensions in which we see other people. We tend to very quickly and rapidly identify people as either on the scale of warm, so are they nice or are they mean? And then the next is whether they're competent. Can they accomplish their goals or can they not? Argument comes out of sort of evolution, where you want to first establish friend or foe, and then is this a capable friend or foe? When we first came across this model, we were interested in applying it to robots. And we have a large database of robot images now, social robots. And we have 342. So we use the same paradigm that Fiske has used and many others to look at this across cultures, across time. and found that people evaluated robots in very much the same way. That they viewed a robot that was fuzzy or had big eyes relative to their head as warm, and they viewed robots that had no fur or showed insides as competent. So we could predict really well warmth and competence. And so again, you might ask, well, why does that matter? Well, it leads to intentions around behavior and emotion. So I tend to have an emotional reaction. If somebody is highly warm, really warm and really competent, I can admire them and I want to behave like them and I want to help them. If, however, they're really competent but not warm, I may be afraid of them. They may trigger things like fear or envy, and I may try to avoid them or perhaps even harm them. And we can get these kinds of interactions for each of the quadrant: high warm, high competent, high warmth, low competence. I pity those people and I try to avoid them. And then low competence, low warmth, I actually have contempt. I dislike them. And we've shown that then that it affects how people want to interact with the robots, whether they want to help a robot or whether they want to hurt a robot. In the context of a building, I was wondering whether this kind of idea would scale up. Do people look at a building and think, well, it's warm or it's competent? And at first I was like, no, they're going to think I'm crazy. But then I just started doing some research into the idea of personality of buildings. And there's like books and books written about how people assess personality in buildings, though I found no references to the notion of the stereotype content model. So given how powerful this model has been across psychology, I started to think about the buildings that I've been entering in the last week in terms of the warmth and competence, and found that these sort of sensations, these initial impressions, came very quickly. And then I was starting to think, well, does that affect whether I'd ever want to help a building or whether it would evoke a certain emotion? And the emotion part came to me very easily and quickly, so this is a little just self-introspection. But I still, because I haven't been in a lot of spaces that have been sort of human building interactive, I don't know what that means for how I might treat a building or not. And so I think we might be approaching like an interesting boundary for how this very well studied, very thoroughly tested theory might work. So those are the two concepts I wanted to share with you. Folk theory, how people understand things, but also form attitudinal and affective impressions of these complex systems, and buildings capable of interacting with humans fit that very well. And one thing I think is important for people designing these buildings to know is that if you evoke a certain kind of folk theory and that leads to problems with interacting with the building, you're starting off with a major issue. The other one's stereotype content model is going to be how people will very quickly form impressions of a building. I think if it's interactive, they'll treat the building like a human, much like Cliff Nass and Byron Reeves have talked about the way we treat technology as humans, and open up a whole new field of how to rigorously assess the personality of buildings rather than talking about them in sort of generalities. It'll be interesting to ground it in this psychological theory. So I think I had 10 minutes, and according to the clock, my clock, that's 10 minutes. And I wanted to save 5 minutes for questions if you have any. Thank you all for paying attention to me at this distance. Thank you.